On a quiet June afternoon, SkyReach Airways Flight 9018 was preparing for takeoff from Denver to Seattle. The last rays of sunlight spilled across the marble floor of Gate C9, scattering in shards of light like shattered glass. Amid the bustle of business-class passengers dressed in tailored suits and carrying designer bags, no one paid attention to the middle-aged man in a plain black t-shirt and slightly faded jeans who boarded the plane with an unusually calm demeanor. What they didn't know was that among them stood the man who owned 25% of SkyReach Airways and served as its chief executive officer, Elijah Monroe, 43 years old, one of the few black leaders ranked among the 50 most powerful executives in America. But today, Elijah wasn't here to lead. He was here to observe. And he chose to do so unseen. No badge of authority, no assistant, no priority boarding ticket stamped with an executive title. Elijah had simply booked a business-class seat under his real name, with no special requests. This was part of his personal investigation, following several quiet complaints from passengers suggesting that SkyReach showed signs of unequal service, not overt racism, but subtle discrimination based on appearance, on how someone dressed, carried themselves, or the unspoken impression of which class they belonged to upon first glance. Elijah wanted to know, within the system he helped build, did these unspoken biases truly exist? As he entered the business class cabin and approached seat 2A, the seat he had booked and paid for, he barely had time to place his hand on the armrest when a cold voice spoke from behind. "Excuse me, sir. You don't belong in this section," said Heather Logan, a 36-year-old lead flight attendant. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe as if inspecting a defective product, while she clutched her passenger manifest tablet like a badge of judgment. Elijah calmly presented his boarding pass, but Heather didn't even glance at it. "This seat has been reassigned," she said curtly, casting a quick look toward economy, as if signaling him to return to a more appropriate place. Then came Kyle Denton, a 30-year-old male flight attendant with a faint sneer in his voice. "You look more like an economy class kind of guy," he said with a smirk, not even trying to hide his disdain. Elijah's expression remained composed. He extended his Colorado state ID and reiterated that seat 2A had been booked and confirmed. At that moment, the cockpit door opened and out stepped Captain Troy Sanders, a man with a military air, probably in his early 40s, called by Heather. "If you refuse to cooperate, we will have to ask you to deplane." "This seat is reserved for another VIP guest," he declared, casting a quick glance behind him toward Gregory and Vanessa Alton, a stylish white couple with platinum status tags, holding glasses of white wine as if stepping into a ballroom rather than a cabin. No one on board knew that within minutes, the man they had tried to remove would place a direct call to SkyReach's executive board, triggering an emergency protocol never before activated and bringing down a long-standing veil of systemic bias. But in that moment, he simply took his seat, still the unassuming Elijah, calm and resolute. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, voice barely above a breath, yet it hung in the air like a weight. And with that sentence, the power game had officially begun. Elijah Monroe never placed his faith in reports filled only with numbers. To him, the real measure of a brand lay in the honest feelings of its customers. In recent months, SkyReach Airways had received a growing number of vague yet troubling complaints, staff showing attitude toward passengers who weren't dressed expensively, unequal treatment even in premium cabins, or a persistent sense of having to prove one's right to simply be there. Elijah read each line, remembered every detail, but what disturbed him most wasn't the content of the complaints, it was the response from the PR department, brushing things off with vague apologies, blaming misunderstandings and procedures. So he decided to step into that gray zone himself. That is why, on a June afternoon, the CEO, who usually wore bespoke suits and traveled by private jet, chose to show up in Denver wearing old jeans, a plain black t-shirt, a pair of faded gray sneakers, no watch, and no accessories. He walked from the domestic parking lot, printed his own boarding pass at a kiosk, and queued like everyone else. Seat 2A in business class had been booked under his real name, Elijah Monroe, with no priority tags and using an obscure secondary email. Everything had been carefully arranged to ensure he would not be recognized and, more importantly, would not be treated any differently because of his name. Boarding the plane, Elijah observed the business-class cabin leather seats, warm ceiling lights, a subtle scent of wood, and the kind of quiet promised in every ad. But from the very first moment, the concern he feared became reality. Heather Logan's eyes were anything but neutral. Hers was the look of someone who had already decided, he doesn't belong here. She didn't check his ticket, didn't verify his booking. She simply looked at a black man dressed plainly and made her judgment. Kyle Denton, her younger colleague, didn't ask questions either. One look was enough for him to throw out comments as if he were used to blocking imposters. Neither of them knew who the man in front of them really was, but they had already decided he lacked the qualities to be in that cabin. Elijah didn't need to recall his roots in Chicago or the countless opportunities once denied to him based on appearance, because in this very moment, he was facing it again inside the very organization he had helped build. But he also knew this investigation could not be rushed. No one had been informed of his true identity, because sometimes, to truly understand rot from within, you must come face to face with the very edge of invisibility. And when Heather's gaze shifted from him to welcome Gregory and Vanessa Alton into the cabin, Elijah knew. They, those representing the brand's first point of contact, had chosen to serve a more acceptable image. A white couple, white wine in hand, platinum tags swinging from their necks, offered a polite smile as they noticed him sitting in seat 2A, their seat. No one asked why, no one checked. Only assumptions and unspoken entitlements filled the space. Elijah didn't get up. He didn't argue. He looked at Heather and spoke in the same calm tone. I paid for this seat, and I'm staying. But when Sergeant Megan Rhodes, an airport security officer, stepped forward with her hand hovering near her radio and firmly told him to move or be escorted off, Elijah knew he had stepped directly into the heart of the issue. And this time, he hadn't brought a leather briefcase to sign contracts. He had brought the truth, and he would let the system expose exactly what it had been trying to hide. The atmosphere inside the business-class cabin of Skyreach Flight 918 grew strangely suffocating, as if everyone could sense something was wrong, but no one had the courage to say it aloud. Heather Logan stood firm, holding Elijah's boarding pass, glanced briefly at the valid information, then suddenly tore it cleanly in half, cold and efficient, as if she were disposing of junk mail. This ticket is no longer valid, she declared, then turned to Kyle with a smirk. Coach class probably suits him better. Kyle chuckled, and Elijah remained silent, unmoved, simply gazing down at the torn pieces of paper lying on the carpet like living proof of a systemic whim. From behind, the couple Gregory and Vanessa Alton approached, white wine glasses swirling in hand. They asked no questions, showed no surprise. Their platinum membership tags gleamed like a silent proclamation that this spot belongs to us. Heather signaled with her eyes. They nodded, as if to confirm a prearranged deal, and took seat 2A, Elijah's seat, as though it was a given. No one checked records. No one verified information. No one called central support. There was only silence and assumption. Elijah remained seated. He sat with his hands resting on his lap, eyes straight ahead, his face not angry but calm, so composed that it made the surrounding observers uneasy. Kyle leaned toward Heather and whispered, "Probably printed a fake ticket at home." Heather replied in a flat tone, "Nobody flies business in jeans and a gray t-shirt, not on this flight." Those words didn't go unheard. A few nearby passengers began exchanging glances, and the atmosphere began to shift. In row 4, Tessa Hill, a 39-year-old passenger from Oregon, quietly pulled out her phone and started recording. She didn't know who the black man was, but she knew injustice when she saw it. Sitting beside her, Jordan Blake, a 44-year-old photographer from Florida, nodded and opened his camera app. "This is discrimination. It's going to spread," he murmured. Tessa added, "This isn't a misunderstanding, it's a choice." At that moment, Captain Troy Sanders returned to the cabin, eyes cold as steel. Heather whispered something in his ear, and Elijah was immediately labeled as non-compliant, disruptive before departure. No verification, no questions. Just an order. If you do not vacate the seat, we will have to request security to remove you. Elijah remained still. You are making a serious mistake, he said quietly, as if speaking not to any one person but to the entire system watching him. Heather crossed her arms, tilted her head and sneered. You're nobody. The people who sit in business class, they're real customers. Farther down, another young observer was recording. Jasmine Cho, a 23-year-old trainee flight attendant, had been watching everything, her face torn between confusion and growing clarity. She said nothing, only quietly opened her phone, activated the voice recorder, and slipped it into the inner pocket of her blazer. She didn't know who was right or wrong, but instinct told her something was being hidden, and if it wasn't captured now, it would be denied forever. Elijah looked once more at the captain, then turned to Heather. I will not leave this seat, and I will not be silent. But he also knew sometimes, to expose the truth, you don't need to say much. You simply let the system act as it truly is. And those who witness it, whether passengers, employees, or strangers, will be the most honest recorders. In that small business class cabin, discrimination was no longer a metaphor. It had just been performed in full view before the cameras, the microphones, and dozens of eyes opening wider with every passing minute of silence. Just as the tension in the business class cabin of Skyreach 918 seemed to settle temporarily, Heather Logan suddenly bent over her control iPad, her fingers swiping across the screen with deliberate speed. A passenger in a nearby row caught a glimpse of the seat assignment interface, where the name Elijah Monroe was clearly visible on seat 2A, but only for a flash. Heather pressed and held the entry, scrolled down and confirmed deletion. Now there's no record of that name, she muttered to Kyle Denton. No name, no proof, no one will ever know, Kyle smirked. It's done. Problem disappeared. Jasmine Cho, still standing near the galley, heard every word. She swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the phone in her pocket that was still recording. Those words were more than a procedural violation, they were living proof of a cover-up. Inside her, a quiet fury began to grow, but she remained silent, patient like a sentinel, because she knew that justice doesn't come from impulsive outrage, but from deliberate preparation. In the cabin, Tessa Hill still held her phone aimed directly at the front row. Her first video had already passed 5,000 views in minutes. Jordan Blake uploaded a wide-angle version from his seat with the hashtag #SkyReachTruth, and the live comments began to buzz. Is this the CEO of Skyreach? Public discrimination? Who tore the ticket? Tessa looked up. She was no longer the only one recording. A middle-aged woman in row 5 had also turned on her camera, whispering into her mic, "No one has the right to treat someone who paid in full like that." Heather noticed the stares. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. Standing beside Kyle, she turned to a nearby passenger and sneered, "We've seen people like him fake business class before. They buy economy tickets and print a new one for 2A. Kyle chimed in, "Those shoes probably never touched a lounge." They didn't lower their voices. Their words hung in the air, as if silence meant consent, as if they believed no one would speak out against them. But Elijah remained silent, seated firmly in 2A, his patience not submission, but observation. In his ear, a soft voice came through his wireless earpiece, Chloe Ramirez, his trusted executive assistant for over a decade. "The board has been alerted. I'm forwarding the audio file. Julian is reviewing the logs. Denise is pulling the passenger manifest. Thomas has begun real-time system monitoring. Just give the word." Elijah replied calmly but with clarity, "Let them keep going. I want them to dig their own grave." Gregory and Vanessa Alton were now comfortably seated in 2A and 2B, chatting as if nothing unusual had occurred. Elijah looked at them once, not with anger or hatred, but with quiet disappointment. Not because they took his seat, but because they knew something was wrong and still chose silence. Not loud complicity, but silent complicity, the most dangerous kind. From a row behind, a teenage boy leaned toward his mother and asked softly, "Mom, why are they making that man leave?" She shook her head, her eyes fixed on Heather up front. Because he doesn't look like the people they're used to serving. That answer, though gentle, rang out like a warning bell because it didn't come from someone in power, but from an ordinary mother teaching her child what's right in a world full of excuses. Elijah leaned back, his eyes drifting to the cabin ceiling. 20 years ago, he had been rejected from an airline internship. The recruiter had casually said, "You don't fit the image we're looking for." Today, that same message returned not in words, but in actions, in glances, and in the way they deleted his name from the system as if he had never existed. But Elijah was no longer that young man, and he hadn't come here seeking validation. He came to reveal a truth and dismantle a system that had rotted from within. Less than 10 minutes after the first videos were uploaded, social media algorithms began to react. The hashtags #SkyReachTruth and #HorizonShock simultaneously surged across trending pages. A clip filmed by Tessa Hill capturing the moment Heather tore up the boarding pass had already surpassed 90,000 views before the flight had even left the ground. Another video from Jordan captioned, "This man showed his ID, showed his ticket, and was still called a fraud just because he wasn't wearing a suit," had crossed 100,000 views in mere minutes. The first comments began rolling in. "Can't believe this is 2025. Is he the CEO? Who's going to be held accountable?" Jasmine Cho, still tucked away in the galley, could feel the wave of public outrage building just outside the aircraft. She had recorded nearly the entire conversation between Heather and Kyle, including the moment Kyle mocked Elijah, saying, "Probably bought those pants at Goodwill," and when Heather coldly deleted Elijah's name from the system. But what Jasmine couldn't forget was the calmness in their tone as they did it, as if this wasn't the first time. No verification, no cross-checking, just a gut feeling that the person in front of them didn't fit. She knew that if she didn't speak up now, she would carry the shame of this moment for the rest of her career. Up front, Elijah remained still, a pillar of calm amid an invisible storm. He spoke softly into his earpiece. "Chloe, send the audio file to Julian, Denise, and Thomas. Let them know this is no longer a personal issue, it's systemic." On the other end, Chloe responded quickly and precisely. "Sent. All three are on it. The board has convened an emergency session." Elijah said no more, simply lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Heather, who smirked from across the cabin. "Now it's your turn to start worrying," he said quietly. When Captain Troy Sanders returned to the business class cabin and issued a final warning, "If you do not vacate this seat, you will be removed from the aircraft," Elijah replied in a low but clear voice. "If you lay a hand on me, the consequences won't just be shame, it will be jobs lost." A heavy silence rippled across the cabin. Heather averted her eyes. Kyle began to waver. Megan Rhodes, the security officer, stepped forward, but her hand never touched her radio. There was something in Elijah's tone, not angry, not loud, that made everyone hesitate. At that exact moment, Jasmine stepped out from the galley and into the aisle. Her hand clutched her phone tightly, its screen glowing with a visible recording icon. Her voice trembled, but remained firm. "I heard everything. I saw them erase his name from the log. I recorded it." Heather whipped around, her face drained of color. "You're a trainee. You have no authority to intervene." Jasmine didn't back down. "I know the difference between right and wrong, and this is wrong." Passengers began murmuring. Someone in row 6 whispered to his wife, "She has evidence." Another woman gasped, "They erased his name to cover it up?" Questions began to swirl, and in that atmosphere an old question finally received a new answer. Who is he anyway? "That's Elijah Monroe, CEO of SkyReach. I read about him." "Oh my God, seriously?" In that cabin, the balance of power had shifted. It was no longer one man versus the crew. It was now a system exposing its own decay, surrounded by awakened eyes, recording phones, and questions that could no longer be ignored. Heather felt the weight of it all, but still clung to her mask. "This is a misunderstanding." Elijah rose to his feet, his eyes steady. "No, This is a choice, and everyone is witnessing it. Jasmine did not move from her spot in the center of the cabin, her grip on the phone so tight her knuckles had turned white. She knew there was no turning back. Under the cabin's soft white lights, her voice rang out, not trembling anymore, but firm, resolute. I have the recording, every word. The part where Heather said she would delete his name from the log. The part where Kyle laughed when she said people like him don't belong in business class. I saved it all. Row 4, where Tessa and Jordan had been filming from different angles, suddenly became more animated. Jordan called out, "Post it online. People need to see the truth." Tessa whispered, "That's it. It's over." Heather's face went pale. At first she looked ready to respond, but quickly realized that anything she said now could be caught on camera, played back, and spread at lightning speed. Kyle stepped back toward the galley, his jaw clenched tight, no longer smiling as he usually did. Megan, the security officer, remained still, hand near her radio but not pressing it. The air grew thick, as if everyone were waiting for something to break. And then, it did. Through Elijah's earpiece came the voice of Chloe Ramirez, this time clear and decisive. "The board has reviewed the evidence. Julian is examining the full system log. Denise has requested a real-time data match with the central servers. Thomas just made the call. If the crew makes one more wrong move, you have full authority under Clause 17A, Emergency Executive Oversight." Elijah pressed his lips together but said nothing. He didn't need to. When he lifted his gaze toward Heather, Kyle, and Captain Troy Sanders, they all understood the tide had shifted. That was when Emma, a passenger in row 5, suddenly stood up, holding her phone high, still recording. "I've been filming this whole time. Anyone want footage of them tearing up a boarding pass and calling a passenger a fraud?" She slowly panned her camera across Heather, Kyle, and Megan. No one dared approach her. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man shouted, "I saw his pass light up green. They kicked him out because he was wearing a gray t-shirt and sneakers." Another voice chimed in, "And because he's a black man." The evidence wasn't just in the recordings. It was in the panic in Heather's eyes as she realized she'd lost control. In Kyle's stunned expression as he realized he'd gone too far. In the silence of Captain Troy, who had assumed his word was final. But now, standing before him, was the CEO, a co-owner of the Airline, and the focal point of a growing firestorm online, watched by hundreds of thousands. Elijah scanned the cabin, not as someone giving orders, but as someone listening. "Chloe," he said quietly into his earpiece, "make sure every passenger is refunded and receives an official apology from the board. Anyone affected today will no longer need to prove they deserve respect." Chloe responded, "Already processing. Denise is signing off on the compensation package. Julian just sent a legal hold request to preserve the original system logs." At the back of the cabin, Megan Rhodes could feel her heartbeat rising. She hadn't laid a hand on Elijah, but she had stood by silently for too long, and that silence now felt like a weight. Jasmine looked at her not with judgment, but with expectation. And Megan knew if she didn't speak up now, there might never be another chance to hold on to what was right within her. The cabin lights cast a soft glow on Elijah Monroe's face as he slowly rose to his feet, unhurried, as if every step he took carried its own weight. All eyes turned to him, no longer with doubt or judgment, but with anticipation, waiting for a statement, an action, a final move to close the curtain on the injustice that had just unfolded before them. Elijah glanced at Heather, who had stepped back halfway. Kyle had pressed himself against the cabin wall, and Captain Troy remained standing in the middle of the aisle, his face flushed as if he had just realized that control no longer rested in his hands. "I'm asking everyone to return to their seats," Captain Troy spoke, his voice sharper than before, trying to reclaim the last shreds of authority. But no one sat down. Tessa kept her camera pointed at Elijah. Jordan called out, "No one moves. We stand with him. We..." Another passenger added, "You tore up his boarding pass, mocked him, and now you expect us to be quiet?" A murmur rippled through the cabin like a slow-burning flame catching fire. At that moment, Megan Rhodes, the security officer, stepped forward, not out of protocol but caught between duty and conscience. She hesitated, then asked, "Sir, are you?" Elijah looked directly at her. Megan, you can check the system, he said calmly. If Heather hasn't wiped everything, you'll see the name Elijah Monroe assigned to seat 2A. I'm the CEO of Skyreach Airways and the largest remaining shareholder in this company. His words landed like a gavel hitting the bench. Heather stumbled back another step, murmuring, "No, that's not possible." Kyle looked up at Elijah, his eyes flickering between horror and despair. Captain Troy stared at Elijah as if he were coming face to face with a man whose authority far surpassed his own, right there on the aircraft he thought he commanded. A place where every decision usually belonged to the crew had now become a stage for a total reversal of power. Elijah didn't raise his voice or speak with theatrics, but each word hit with quiet force. I don't need to prove I deserve respect. What I do need is to prove this system needs to change. And today, you all helped me gather the final evidence. He turned his attention to Chloe through the earpiece. Is the board ready? Chloe's voice came through crystal clear. They're unanimous. Emergency Clause 17A is in effect. You have full authority to handle the crew on site. The air tightened. Heather opened her mouth. I didn't know who you were, Elijah cut in. Exactly. And that's the problem. You saw a black man in a plain t-shirt and assumed he didn't belong here. He turned to Kyle. Did you know I've been a loyal business class passenger for years? You've greeted me 3 times before, but today, just because I wasn't wearing an expensive watch, you called me a fraud. Kyle didn't respond. His jaw trembled. Captain Troy took a deep breath and stepped forward. I was wrong, but I didn't know. You're the captain, Elijah interrupted, no longer patient. You are the final decision maker in this cabin, and you made that decision with no proof, no verification, no second thought. That's not a mistake. That is systemic bias. In the row behind them, Jordan whispered, "We are watching history unfold right in front of us." Tessa pointed her camera back toward Elijah. Not everyone can stand up in a moment like this, but he did. The moment Elijah Monroe confirmed that the emergency authority had been greenlit by the board, the aircraft cabin seemed to enter a different state where words became unnecessary and only the truth stood at the center. Heather sank into the flight attendant's jump seat, her eyes vacant, staring into space as if she'd fallen into a dream with no exit. Kyle leaned against the cabin wall, sweat soaking through the back of his uniform shirt. Captain Troy, once the commanding voice in the sky, stood in silence, no longer with a defense to offer. Elijah gently tapped his earpiece. Chloe, confirm the flight crew status. Chloe Ramirez's voice came through steady and clear. All data has been locked in storage. The board has flagged the employee accounts of Heather Logan, Kyle Denton, and Captain Troy Sanders. All 3 are suspended effective immediately. Replacement crew is en route to Gate C9. Elijah nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the very people who had just moments ago tried to deny his place on his own company's flight. He took a few steps forward and looked directly at Megan Rhodes, the security officer who had nearly executed an irreversible action. Do you still intend to enforce the removal order? Megan shook her head and softly said, I won't lay a hand on you, and I'm sorry. Elijah didn't respond right away. Instead, he returned to the center of the cabin where the passengers remained crowded together, a wall of witnesses, phone cameras glowing, their eyes filled with intent. I know we're not just delayed today, he said, his voice low but resonant throughout the cabin. We've witnessed something many have long suspected, but never clearly seen, that prejudice doesn't need to be spoken aloud to cause harm. It is silent, but it corrodes. Jasmine Cho, still near row 3, pulled a backup memory card from her pocket and held it up. I saved the entire recording. Even if someone tries to delete the data, I have a copy. A round of applause followed, not loud but steady and sincere. Megan nodded quietly toward Jasmine in a gesture of gratitude she couldn't quite find the words for. Elijah, Chloe continued, the new crew is at the gate. 2 HR managers are escorting the previous crew off the plane. Their access to Skyreach has been revoked. All internal systems are locked. Elijah replied softly. Turn the list over to legal. Make sure nothing slips through this time. Meanwhile, heavy footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin. Heather, Kyle, and Captain Troy walked down the aisle. No one spoke a word. The passengers parted to the sides, forming a silent corridor of witnesses, an aisle heavy with unspoken judgment. Jordan murmured, "This is the first time I've seen power truly serve justice." As Heather passed Elijah, her eyes red and swollen, she paused for a moment. "I didn't know." Elijah didn't look at her. "And because you didn't know, you didn't see me as human. That's why you no longer belong here." Heather said nothing. She walked away quietly. As the cabin door closed behind the former crew, a stillness swept through like the first chill of early winter. No more arguments, no more doubts. Elijah turned and looked at every person in the cabin. To everyone who filmed, who spoke up, who stood their ground, "I see you. Not because I'm the CEO, but because I've been the one people pretended not to see." An older woman near the aisle gently placed her hand over her heart. "Today, you didn't just stand for yourself, you stood for everyone who never got the chance to speak." Elijah bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for not bowing yours when justice was pushed out of the cabin." The atmosphere inside Flight 988's cabin was no longer tense, but it wasn't fully relaxed either. It was a kind of calm after the storm where wounds were still fresh, yet people began to stand tall again and look ahead. The front cabin door had closed behind those removed from the system, and those who remained were the ones who had earned trust. Elijah Monroe stepped forward to where Jasmine Cho, the trainee flight attendant, was still standing, her hand gripping the memory card and the phone containing all the evidence. He gently held out his hand. Jasmine hesitated briefly, then silently handed him the data. "You didn't just protect my dignity," Elijah said, his voice touched with emotion. "You protected the honor of this entire airline." He paused. "Skyreach doesn't need more people. We need character. And you've proven you have it." Jasmine's eyes widened. Her lips parted as if to reply, but no words came. Elijah nodded. "From this moment on, you are officially appointed as a full flight attendant and will be enrolled in our Advanced Leadership Development Program. Your badge will be pinned today." From the back of the cabin, a round of applause erupted louder this time, more distinct. It was not just for a brave young woman, but a collective affirmation that justice can still exist in even the most fragile moments. In Elijah's earpiece, Chloe Ramirez reported, "The board has released an internal announcement across the entire network. All departments are being instructed to review unresolved complaints from the past 12 months. David Varela will lead internal auditing. Denise Albright is working with the legal team to forward concealed cases to the Department of Justice." Elijah nodded gently. "It's finally time to clean house from the root." "What about Megan Rhodes?" Chloe asked through the earpiece. Elijah turned toward the security officer who stood quietly by the aisle, eyes downcast, uncertain of her place now. He didn't rush to judgment. "You didn't harm me, but you stood silent for too long while wrongdoing unfolded. That's not innocent, but I believe people can learn." Megan looked up, her voice trembling. "I want to make it right. I'm no longer sure I deserve to." Elijah replied softly, "No one is born perfectly right. What matters is whether you're willing to learn from the person you once ignored." Then he turned to Jasmine. "From now on, you will personally mentor Rhodes through retraining. Skyreach needs those who speak up and those willing to listen and change." Jasmine looked at Elijah, then at Megan. "I agree," she said. But only if we're doing this for real. No half measures." Elijah smiled, not a polite smile, but the nod of a man who had endured and now saw someone ready to carry on the values he believed in. In the back, passengers began to breathe easier. A young boy in row 8 whispered, "Mom, is that man a superhero?" His mother smiled, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "No, sweetheart, he's just someone who refused to stay silent." And that alone made Elijah a symbol. Flight 918 departed the runway at 8:19 p.m., nearly 2 hours behind schedule, yet not a single passenger expressed annoyance. Because that flight, though delayed, arrived precisely on time with something people thought they had lost trust. In the night sky between Denver and Seattle, the cabin lights dimmed, seats gently reclined, but the feeling inside each heart was full. Elijah Monroe sat in seat 2A, exactly where he should have been from the start, and this time there were no suspicious glances. The man seated beside him simply nodded, asking nothing more, for he understood that some moments are best acknowledged with silent respect. At the front galley, Jasmine Cho, now an official flight attendant, was serving drinks with the new crew. The uniform no longer looked too big for her petite frame, and the freshly pinned badge on her chest seemed to glow brighter under the plane's lighting. She moved down the aisle, gently checking on each passenger as if mending a wound she had helped expose. Megan Rhodes observed quietly from the back of the cabin, every gesture from Jasmine a lesson no classroom could teach, that courage does not come from authority, but from conscience. Tessa Hill and Jordan Blake kept their eyes fixed on their phone screens. "The first video just hit 3 million views," Jordan whispered, "but the clip of Jasmine holding up the memory card is spreading even faster." Tessa nodded, eyes misty. "It's the first time I've seen the internet become not just a place to tell stories, but a place where justice begins." At the front of the cabin, Elijah was listening to updates from Chloe. "The official statement will go nationwide tomorrow morning. James has contacted the press and Sarah is finalizing the documents for the Department of Justice. Reforms will begin at the foundation, retraining, a direct internal reporting channel to the board, and eliminating the culture of concealment." Elijah replied softly, "Good. And Mia?" "She's being nominated as deputy head of regional training. She's waiting at the Seattle gate to meet you," Chloe confirmed. Elijah smiled. A new generation. The plane glided across a sea of clouds, cutting through a silver-tinted sky. Elijah looked out the window, where the stars had begun to appear, the kind of light one only sees when looking up at just the right moment. "Skyreach isn't just an airline," he murmured to himself. "It's a place where no one has to look a certain way to be treated like a human being." That sentence would soon become the first line in the company's new cultural handbook. As the plane descended, the pilot's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing to land in Seattle. On behalf of the new crew and all of Skyreach, thank you for your patience, for speaking up, and for believing." There was no applause in the cabin, as is customary. Instead, there were nods, meaningful glances, a silence that carried deep respect. Elijah rose, adjusted his jacket, then looked around the cabin, a place once marked by prejudice, now a testament to transformation. As he exited the plane, Jasmine and Megan bowed slightly, not as part of protocol, but out of gratitude. Outside, the media had begun to gather, but Elijah said only one thing to Chloe before stepping into the night. "I didn't come to stir the waters. I came to start a new wind." And that wind, in the Seattle night, had truly begun to rise from a single cabin, to a corporation, and out into an entire industry.